Táid réile bogad Ráiteas Tarannseo, mír dahead a sé, Ráiteas maidir le Tuarascáil, Chríochnaitheach and Tascfhórsa on Bia Mara Deireadh Fómhair. Statements on the Seafood Taskforce, final report October 2021. I'm calling on the Minister for Agriculture to make your statement.
Thank you, Laskin Corla, and thanks to yourself and my colleagues here for the discretion, and my apologies for a slight delay there. So I want to thank the House for this opportunity to update on the outcome of the Seafood Taskforce process that I instigated in March of this year in response to the unacceptable outcome for Ireland's seafood sector of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement between the European Union and the United Kingdom. It's appropriate, Laskin Corla, that I begin by recalling the details of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement as they pertain to our seafood sector. It was clear during the Trade and Cooperation Agreement negotiations that fishing quotas were going to be a particularly difficult issue, and it was one of the principal reasons for the protracted negotiations for the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. A no-deal Brexit scenario would have seen all EU vessels barred from UK waters and possibly displaced into Ireland's fishing zone as well. That was a doomsday scenario. The Irish fishing fleet catches about 1/3 of its catch in UK waters, and if access to UK waters was denied in a no-deal scenario, it risked losing access to that catch, and in addition, other EU vessels operating in UK waters would be displaced into our waters too. When the Taoiseach and I met the fishing industry this time last year, they all identified a no-deal Brexit as the worst possible outcome for the Irish fishing industry. The agreement reached was less severe than that, and less severe than it would have been had the Barnier Taskforce agreed to the UK negotiating demands. Nevertheless, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement was still a very painful one for Ireland. The agreement reached provided that as the price for continued access by EU vessels to UK waters, there would be a transfer of quotas across a range of fish stocks from EU member states to the UK. In January of this year, I published an analysis of the quota transfers for Ireland across the different stocks and the implications. The quota transfers are to be spread out until 2026. The aggregate final quota transfer by Ireland to the UK is valued at €43 million loss to Ireland's fishing sector by 2026, amounting to a 15% reduction compared to the overall value of Ireland's 2020 quotas. The upfront loss for 2021 is very sizable at around 60% of the total, or a loss of some €26 million at the quayside. My department's analysis also showed that because of the stocks concerned, Ireland is contributing a disproportionate share of its quotas compared to almost all other member states, and this is clearly inequitable in terms of burden sharing. Throughout 2021, I have consistently made it very clear to the Commission and other member states that Ireland considers that the transfer to the UK involves a very high share of some of our most important stocks. I pointed out that within the Common Fisheries Policy, Ireland contributes by providing rich fishing grounds for EU member states, and our exclusive economic zone provides spawning and nursery grounds for many of the core stocks which are shared with the UK and on which the Trade and Cooperation Agreement quota package and the Common Fisheries Policy depends. I also strongly express my disappointment that the principle of burden sharing within the EU member states has not been adequately respected. I made clear that the inequitable relative contribution of quota share by Ireland has contributed to a strong sense of grievance within our fishing industry and indeed more broadly. I have raised the matter of inequitable burden sharing at EU level and in bilateral meetings with the Commissioner and other EU member states at each and every suitable opportunity that has arisen, and I will continue to do so. During his visit to Ireland at the end of September, Commissioner Sinavicius met with industry representatives in Killybegs and heard directly from them that Ireland has paid too high a share of quota under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. I followed up with a bilateral with the Commissioner on all the issues arising. An Taoiseach and I met with the Commissioner to further emphasise, from a government perspective, that addressing burden sharing is a priority for Ireland, and the Taoiseach has pursued this matter with the Commission President. I have made clear that this important element of the Common Fisheries Policy must be included by the Commission as part of the full Common Fisheries Policy review and form part of the formal review and the Commission report to Council and Parliament on the functioning of the Common Fisheries Policy. Last week, and Taoiseach, having previously met the President of the European Commission on burden sharing, again wrote to President Ursula von der Leyen on the issue of the inequitable burden on Ireland in terms of quota transfer under the TCA, and to reiterate the Government's call to find practical ways within the EU to address this issue. I, as Minister, have continuously pushed strongly that a solution must be found, and I intend to continue to keep the focus on this situation and use any opportunity available to seek constructive solutions that would help to alleviate this unacceptable position. Together with these initiatives on addressing burden sharing, I was determined that our fisheries sector and the coastal communities that depend on fishing should be appropriately assisted with the impacts of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. In March of this year, Laskin-Corla established a seafood task force whose terms of reference were to examine the impacts of the TCA on our fisheries sector and coastal communities, and to identify initiatives that could be taken to provide supports for development and restructuring, so as to ensure a profitable and sustainable fishing fleet, and to identify opportunities for jobs and economic activity in coastal communities dependent on fishing. I also asked the Task Force to consider and recommend constructive actions that would help to alleviate the inequitable relative contribution of quota by Ireland in the agreement. I asked the Task Force to consider how all available funding streams could be used to address, to the extent possible, the initiatives identified and the state agencies to support those initiatives. An important context for the work of the Task Force was an EU Brexit Adjustment Reserve, or the BAR Fund, that was being negotiated at EU level at the time I established the Task Force. The BAR regulation was enacted on the 6th of October 2021, with Ireland allocated by far the largest share of funds at almost €1.2 billion in current prices, recognising that Ireland is the member state most impacted by the departure of the UK and by the Trade and Cooperation Agreement outcome. Fisheries and coastal communities were an important element of the negotiations on the member state BAR allocations, with fishing in UK waters and maritime border regions, with the UK accounting for €184 million of Ireland's BAR allocation. The purpose of the BAR is to provide EU supports to counter the adverse economic, social, territorial and, where appropriate, environmental consequences of the withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the Union in those member states most adversely affected by the withdrawal, and to mitigate the related negative impact on the social, economic and territorial cohesion of the Union. The BAR has a particular focus on regions and local communities and sectors most affected by Brexit, understandably. Importantly, the BAR is 100% EU funded, and the Commission will be providing pre-financing this year and in 2022 and in 2023, making the BAR an invaluable tool for Ireland and other member states to use to counter the impacts of Brexit and the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. The BAR will see Ireland implement Brexit mitigation measures this year and next year, or in 2022 and 2023, across the economic sectors most impacted by Brexit. The eligibility period for the BAR ends in 2023. Formal BAR funding applications to the Commission will follow by 2024, which will make the pre-financing already provided definitive. Another important context for the work of the Task Force was the new European Maritime Fisheries and Aquaculture Fund, or the EMFAF, which again was being negotiated at EU level when I established the Task Force. The MFAF regulation has since been enacted on the 7th of July this year, and Ireland has allocated €142 million in EU funds under the MFAF, with the Government of Ireland to provide co-funding for this level of EU investment. Unlike the BAR, the European Maritime Fisheries and Aquaculture Fund is solely focused on member states' seafood sectors and coastal communities. My department is preparing a new seafood development programme under the MFAF, and I expect this to be adopted next year. In establishing the Task Force, I strongly believe that such a once-in-a-generation event as the Trade and Cooperation Agreement required a collective response, involving the seafood businesses and coastal communities most affected by the Trade and Cooperation Brexit Agreement, and who have the intimate knowledge of the sector to know what initiatives are best able to address the impacts of the agreement. The task force comprised 10 representatives of the fishing sector, including the 4 main fishing cooperatives in Castletownbere, Greencastle, Rossaveel and Clogherhead, the Irish South and East Fish Producers Organisation, the Irish South and West Fish Producers Organisation, the Killybegs Fishermen's Organisation, the Irish Islands Marine Resource Organisation, the Irish Fish Processors and Exporters Association, and the National Inshore Fisheries Forum. It also included representatives of the aquaculture and sector coastal communities, and a range of state bodies with an important role to play in addressing the impacts of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, including Enterprise Ireland, Údarás na Gaeltachta, Bord Bia, Bord East Giwara, and coastal local authorities. The task force was led by Aidan Cotter, former CEO of Bord Bia, who was assisted by a steering group of Margaret Daly, Deputy CEO of seafood processor Errigal Bay Limited, and Micheál O'Cinnéide, former Director of the Marine Institute and member of the Aquaculture Licensing Appeals Board. The task force, Laskin-Corda, undertook its work with great enthusiasm and professionalism. It met on 14 occasions over a 7-month period, and I know there was much work undertaken outside of those meetings as well. To assist its work, the task force undertook a public consultation and received 27 submissions. Task force members also made multiple submissions to inform its deliberations. These submissions, much expert analysis by BIM, and the expertise of the task force members helped to inform a full and detailed examination of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement impacts by the task force, and a healthy debate within the task force on its recommendations. I received the final report of the Seafood Task Force, Navigating Change, on the 11th of October. The report recommended 16 support schemes at a total estimated cost of €423 million. The task force acknowledged in its report that its recommendations would give rise to substantial public expenditure, which will need careful consideration to ensure that the best possible value for money is obtained whenever public money is being spent or invested, as required under the Government's Public Expenditure Code. The task force also acknowledged that the assessment of the range of measures recommended, the development of detailed schemes, and submission for state aid approval can only be approached on a phased basis, and accordingly will be progressed on a prioritised basis. The task force requested that a full assessment of the proposed support schemes by the relevant government departments and state agencies against the necessary government criteria for public expenditure be carried out with a view to implementing the schemes subject to any necessary modifications. It proposed in its report that during the 2021 to 23 period, the measures necessary to implement the task force recommendations should, to the greatest extent possible, be funded from Ireland's allocation under the Brexit Adjustment Reserve. Of the task force recommended support schemes, perhaps in the region of €300 million could potentially be eligible for funding under the bar, subject of course to other funding priorities for the bar, and to government assessment of the recommended schemes and their being accepted. The balance of the recommended schemes would fall to be funded over a longer period of time under my department's Seafood Development Programme, again should they be accepted by government. I propose now to outline some of the recommended support schemes. Without doubt, the most significant scheme recommended by the task force is the implementation of a permanent voluntary decommissioning scheme for the whitefish fleet at a cost of €66 million, recommended to be funded under the bar. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement quota cuts have had wide-ranging impacts on our seafood sector and coastal communities, depending on the seafood sector. But most of all, they call into question the economic viability of the whitefish fleet as it stands. With the lower quotas available post-Brexit, which will continue to decline on a phased basis up to 2026, our entire whitefish fleet will suffer diminishing economic returns. This is not sustainable economically and risks being a catalyst for breaches of fishing regulations. To inform the Taskforce on the scale of fleet restructuring required, a profitability analysis was carried out by BIM. This analysis quantified the number of vessels required to be removed from the fleet in order to return the various fleet segments to the current level of profitability pre-trade and cooperation agreement. This analysis estimated that some 60 whitefish, polyvalent and beam trawl vessels of a gross tonnage of 8,000 GT would need to be removed so as to return these fleet segments to profitability. This equates to 26% of the whitefish fleet by number. Removing this amount of capacity would potentially free up approximately €38 million of quota for the benefit of vessels remaining in the fleet, thereby securing their future viability. The Taskforce recommended a decommissioning scheme of this scale. This is a very severe blow to the whitefish fleet and to the coastal communities dependent on fishing. That much is clear. However, I note that the Taskforce was unanimous in recommending this initiative, and the Taskforce included all of the main representatives of the fishing fleet. The recommendation, of course, reflects the post-Brexit reality of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. That is, less fish to be shared among the whitefish fleet, and so the Taskforce concluded it is absolutely necessary to voluntarily shrink the fleet to this extent, so that the remaining vessels can survive in business. Permanently leaving the fleet and the livelihood many families have known for generations is a major decision for any vessel owner. The Taskforce recommended the scheme be voluntary, and of course that is absolutely appropriate. It estimated the necessary compensation for those leaving the fleet at up to €12,000 per gross tonne. This amount would cover all costs, including vessel owner compensation, crew payments and costs for scrapping of vessels. I'm mindful that crew members of fishing vessels being decommissioned must be compensated as a mandatory condition of the payment to the vessel owner, and I will be ensuring that this happens. As an important complementary measure to the decommissioning scheme, the Taskforce recommended that scheme payments be subject to similar tax treatment as the decommissioning scheme implemented in 2008. The Taskforce believed that this was essential to incentivise sufficient vessel owners to apply under the scheme if it is to reach its target to take out sufficient capacity to restore incomes and fleet balance to the pre-TCA situation. In an important recommendation to accompany the recommended decommissioning scheme, the Taskforce report recommended that a scheme be implemented to essentially decommission off-register fleet capacity. Off-register or latent capacity is fishing capacity that is licensed for use, but not currently in operation for a variety of reasons, such as vessels being lost at sea, being damaged or in need of repair or upgrade, and vessels that are up for sale. My department's licensing authority for sea fishing boats maintains a register of capacity that is currently active or on register and capacity that is inactive or off register. Off register capacity is very relevant to the proposed voluntary whitefish decommissioning scheme because it is a possible route back into the fleet for vessel owners whose boat has been decommissioned. While off register capacity is latent and does not use up quotas, should a former vessel owner purchase off-register capacity and use it to introduce a new vessel to the fleet, this would take up quota, negating the benefits of the voluntary decommissioning scheme. This issue of off-register capacity was identified as a serious risk to the success of a decommissioning scheme in a cost-benefit analysis conducted on behalf of BIM by Grant Thornton in 2016. Grant Thornton found that there was some level of re-entry to the fleet following previous decommissioning schemes. Of 73 vessels decommissioned, 19 new vessels were reintroduced. The Grant Thornton report recommended that a decommissioning scheme should not be implemented unless the issue of off-register capacity is addressed in tandem. At the time of the Taskforce report, there was 15,466 gross tonnes of off-register capacity, almost twice the level of capacity that the Taskforce recommends be decommissioned. This is clearly a significant risk to the success of the decommissioning proposal. So the Taskforce recommends that we implement a once-off, scheme to buy out off-register capacity at a set price to be determined. The process of preparing the details of a decommissioning scheme, conducting a new cost-benefit analysis is required under the Public Spending Code for a scheme of this size, agreeing across government that the proposed scheme should proceed, legislating for tax treatment of scheme payments, and securing state aid clearance is all, of course, very time-consuming. Should the voluntary decommissioning scheme proceed, vessel owners will need some time to reflect on their own situation and the payments offered under the scheme. And there will be time taken as well for the application and approval process. Taken together, these matters mean it would be perhaps summer 2022 before the benefits of the scheme would be felt by other vessel owners in terms of available quota being shared across a smaller than previous cohort of vessels. For these reasons, the Taskforce recommended that a second round of voluntary temporary fleet tie-up schemes supports be implemented in 2022 for the whitefish fleet. The House will be aware that a voluntary temporary tie-up scheme is already being implemented over the October to December period at a cost of €12 million, as was recommended by the Taskforce in its June 2021 interim report to me. That scheme is assisting the whitefish fleet with the reduced incomes in 2021 arising from the TCA quota reductions this year. So a second round of tie-up in 2022 is proposed to similarly support the income of the fleet pending the full benefits of a decommissioning scheme being felt across the fleet. That proposal is costed by the Taskforce at €12 million in 2022 and is recommended to be funded under the bar. I now want to turn to the wider impacts to Lascaux of the TCA quota cuts. I said earlier how the TCA quota cuts undermine the viability of our fishing fleet, and I outlined a proposal from the Taskforce to take out 60 vessels from the whitefish fleet. Should such a scheme proceed and achieve its targets, we could see perhaps 400 crew members lose their jobs. A separate impact of the TCA quota cuts is a significant loss of raw material supply to our vibrant seafood processing sector. Less fish being landed by Irish vessels means less raw material supply for our processors to be transformed into the value-added seafood products we see in our supermarket shelves and which have underpinned the strong growth in seafood exports in recent years. Replacing that raw material is not easy, but there are possibilities. There are logistical difficulties and cost issues in seeking to import supply from the UK, particularly so when other member states impacted by the TCA are seeking to do the same. There is, of course, an abundance of fish caught off our coast by other member state vessels, and these generally return to their home ports to land their catch. Between 2015 and 2019, the Irish fishing fleet caught on average 38% of the value and 35% of the volume of all fish caught in our 200-mile zone. Clearly, there is significant potential, particularly with rising oil costs, to attract an increasing amount of the fish caught by other fleets into Ireland to drive the development of our processing and other marine support industries. We have seen some great successes in recent years, particularly in Castletownbere and Kellybegs, in attracting these foreign vessels to land their catch in Ireland. But by further developing our processing and support industries, we can create a more attractive market proposition to encourage more EU, UK and Norwegian vessels to sell their catch to Irish processors. The loss of raw material supply to our processors, if not addressed through positive interventions as recommended by the Taskforce, risks these processors losing hard-won markets, risks reducing their profitability, and risks loss of employment in coastal communities already impacted by the loss of employment from decommissioned vessels. A further knock-on effect of the necessary voluntary decommissioning of up to 60 fishing vessels is the impact on ancillary and support service industries in coastal communities. Less vessels mean less boat maintenance work, less net making, less provisioning. This outcome risks further loss of employment in coastal communities. The widely representative task force that I put together carefully considered all of these interrelated impacts and recommended an integrated response via investment in marine infrastructure, in seafood processing and in aquaculture supported by community-led local development. In relation to the seafood processing sector, which comprises about 160 firms, the task force recommended facilitating substantial investment in those seafood processing enterprises to support greater utilisation of raw material, improved efficiency, developing new offerings, demonstrating quality and sustainability, as well as building capability and innovation through people and processes. This investment will protect and enhance their viability and position them to attract additional raw material. While my department's European Maritime and Fisheries Fund programme has been providing similar supports over the past 7 years, the scheme recommended by the Taskforce would provide temporarily increased graduated grant rates between 30 to 50% during the period of bar funding, i.e. years 22 and 23, with the higher rates targeted on secondary and tertiary processing to provide an immediate stimulus to overcome some of the constraints arising from Brexit. The Taskforce recommended the supports of €90 million be provided predominantly in 2022 and 23 through the bar, and subsequently through the MFAF over the period up to 2027. The Taskforce believed that this level of funding, when combined with industry funding, would give the sector a unique opportunity to implement the transformational change required in response to the TCA. Transformational investment on this scale would foster increased employment in the processing sector, mitigating the losses of employment arising from the TCA quota cuts, and could position our processing sector as an increasingly attractive market for foreign vessels operating off our coasts. In relation to the aquaculture sector, while there are direct impacts of Brexit and the TCA on this sector, similar to many other areas of our economy, the recommendations of the Taskforce for investment in aquaculture are primarily based on the sector's capacity as an alternative native source of raw material supply to our processors and an alternative source of employment in coastal communities. The aquaculture sector shares many elements of the skill set possessed by fishing crew and presents an ideal career opportunity for crew of former fishing vessels, benefiting both the aquaculture sector and former fishermen. Ideally, it keeps former fishermen in their coastal communities. The Taskforce recommends that both BAR and EMFAF funding sources should be utilised as appropriate to develop Irish aquaculture to mitigate against the negative impacts of Brexit that have been most pronounced in other sectors of the Irish seafood sector. It recommended that graduated grant rates should apply so that categories of activity that would be most impactful would be incentivised, with total aid of €60 million being made available for investment over the period up to 2027. This would stimulate the modernisation of aquaculture sites in line with international best practice, increase resource efficiency and reduce environmental impact, advance understanding of market opportunities and innovation capability, and develop technical, marketing and management capability. The Taskforce report notes that public marine infrastructure such as piers, slipways, pontoons, etc. is a critical enabler to maximising the use of and benefits to be gained from our maritime resources. High-quality public-owned marine infrastructure facilities, the development of a myriad of uses and enables commercial fishing, aquaculture, sea angling and other marine leisure and recreational activities to develop and flourish. The development of this range of water-based activities drives related onshore activities too, and helps to diversify and build resilience in our coastal communities. The Taskforce recognises that modern public marine infrastructure is a central and essential element in creating an integrated response to the impact of the TCA on coastal communities. Accessible and safe public marine infrastructure would enable community-led local development through our flag groups to support the development of a wide range of marine activities to diversify and build resilience. The Taskforce proposes that the earlier years of a support scheme would focus on small-scale, shovel-ready local authority projects, which would be funded under the bar and would give immediate construction stimulus to the coastal communities impacted by the TCA. The resulting infrastructure development would provide a longer-term platform for the development of new and diversified economic activity in these coastal communities. The provision of this enhanced publicly owned marine infrastructure would be a key enabler in allowing integrated application at a local level of the Taskforce's other recommended initiatives for the seafood sector, locally led development and marine tourism activities. The Taskforce is recommending an €80 million 5-year initiative for the development of publicly owned marine infrastructure. Community-led local development, or CLLD, empowers communities to support initiatives to create employment and economic activity to sustain livelihoods in an area-based approach, and accordingly has a key role to play in addressing the impact of the TCA on Ireland's coastal communities. For the past 9 years, My department has been implementing to great success a CLLD approach through the 7 Fisheries Local Action Groups, or FLAGs as they're well known as, through my department's European Maritime and Fisheries Fund programme. Funding or providing seed funding for new businesses, funding to diversify or expand, and enabling capacity development that will allow people to use their skills for new opportunities in the marine sector is paramount to keeping those communities viable in the long term. The Taskforce recommends that significant funding is made available through the flags to support coastal communities impacted by Brexit to diversify their economies into the wider marine sector where local skills are particularly suited.
Thank you, Minister.
So I will pass the remainder of my speech on to be read into the record. Last Corla.
And there's 10-minute reply at the end as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I wonder, is there a copy of the speech available? Or could it be made available?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah. Thank you. Now over to Sinn Féin. 22.5 minutes left.
That's great. Yeah, I'll be sharing with Deputy Carfey and I think it's Deputy Walsh, or Rose Conway Walsh, I think is the name of it. Last Corla, the report of the Seafood Task Force is presented as the future of the Irish fishing industry and a blueprint for creating vibrant coastal communities. Whilst there are some good measures in it, and of course welcome funding, we must also face the hard reality. This report, if implemented, will further reduce the Irish fishing fleet and by consequence the Irish fishing industry. So let's set this out. Ireland has in and around 20% of Europe's northern and western fishing waters. 30% of all fish landed in Europe is produced in Irish waters, and yet we have some of the smallest fishing quotas for species in all of Europe. Irish governments, since we joined the EEC in 1973, have made mistake after mistake in terms of building a vibrant and sustainable Irish fishing industry. It is arguable, in fact, whether we want to build or have an industry at all at this point. It seems when this government or previous Irish governments had to negotiate to fight for our fishermen, the default position was to raise the white flag. The Irish fishing industry was always the sacrificial lamb. Remember, Ireland has already taken part in 2 EU-funded decommissioning schemes that dramatically reduced the Irish fleet, and now we have another decommissioning proposal in front of us to get rid of a further 60 boats. In 2006, Minister, there were 280 boats of over 18 metres in the Irish fleet fishing offshore. After this latest scheme, that fleet will be reduced to 1/3 of what it was 15 years ago. What a damning indictment of government policy and failure over the last 15 years. While we tear apart our fishing communities, countries like France and Belgium are investing in the upgrading of their fleets. This is no surprise when you examine the percentage of the fish that they take from our Irish waters compared to that allocated to our own Irish fishing fleet under the Common Fisheries Policy. I say it again, Minister, only 15% or even less of the pie that is the total value of the catch from Irish waters, the exclusive economic zone, under the EU's Common Fishery Policy, is allocated to our Irish fishing fleet. This is utterly shameful. In contrast, 75% of the fish in British waters is allocated to their fishing fleet. Minister, we have long called for a full review of the Common Fisheries Policy. Is there an appetite with the current Irish government or Irish civil service to go to Europe and fight for such a review? We know that there is a partial review on the table to commence in January, but what we need is a full review with everything on the table. We need to find and build solidarity and alliances with other European partners, and we need to reopen the Common Fisheries Policy, truly reopen it once and for all. The unfairness must end, and what better opportunity than now where Brexit changed so much. It is the profound unfairness and injustice above everything, Minister, that really sticks in the craw of the Irish fishing community. For decades, Irish fishermen have watched European fishing vessels come into Irish waters and fish away at huge quotas compared to what Irish boats have, then watch them unload their uninspected catch into frozen container trucks and away back home to their home countries. Meanwhile, Irish vessels are being chased from pillar to post by the SFPA and the Navy with much lower quotas, and recently have been forced to unload their ice catch on the harbours, de-ice it for inspection, and only then send it to the factory for processing. It would be laughable only for it's so serious. Let's take just one example to prove this, and this goes to the so-called heart of relative stability. It has been and continues to be a complete and utter disaster for Irish fishing. During the formative years of 1977 to 1982, the Irish system didn't record their catches in any accurate manner, and so take monkfish. The French currently have an allocation of 50% of monkfish in Irish waters. Ireland has 5%. Is this fair, Minister? Something has to give, and things have to change, and you and your department must lead it. When the flotilla of fishing boats sailed firstly up the River Lee and into Cork City, and then up the River Liffey and into Dublin City this year, it literally marked a sea change. The fishing industry had united in protest and opposition to the disastrous policies of your government and those who preceded you. No more were they going to accept weak negotiation on their behalf. No more white flags or jelly bellies. 2021 has seen pelagic and polyvalent quotas reduced 30%, demersal quotas by 20%, and the inshore fleet reduced to target non-quota shellfish. Our industry is dying, Minister, and as far as industry are concerned, the Irish state are assisting its dying. As I said earlier, the French and Belgian states are state-sponsoring the building of brand new vessels, and we in Ireland are proposing decommissioning, and over 30% of our fleet, over 18 metres offshore fleet, or 60 of our boats. When you step back and think about it, this is worse than bonkers. It is self-destruction. So, Minister, where do we start? Burden sharing must be reopened in these upcoming December talks. The reality is that there was no burden sharing. The burden of Brexit on the European fishing fleet may as well have been undertaken unilaterally by the Irish industry. That must be the starting position. We know negotiations are always tough, but now is the time to show true steel. Once and for all, Ireland needs a Minister for the Marine and the Department of Marine to stand up for our Irish interests. At the very least, you need to go to Brussels with a minimum levelling up approach being imprinted in your thinking. This would take account of at least some small element of the historical loss and unfairness that we have suffered. It would also set a marker for the upcoming review of the CFP at European level. Minister, gone are the days when we are the best boys and girls in the class and we say yes or no, sir, and take what we are given in terms of quotas. It is time to go and defend our industry, be proud in our natural resource, our immense natural resource, outline to Europe what we want and need to build our proud industry. We want our fair share of what is ours and will not stand anymore for being stamped on and told to put up with everything. I refer to the contributions from the various fishing organisations, the producer organisations at yesterday's Oireachtas committee. And I can tell you they didn't enthusiastically endorse this report. They certainly didn't enthusiastically endorse decommissioning. You could see that they did it with a heavy heart. They have fishermen on their books who have no future, through no fault of their own, but through the fault of government after government. They don't believe things will change, and they will avail of the scheme with an extremely heavy heart. The trade and cooperation agreement is being negotiated between Britain and Europe. You need to insist, Minister, and Letitia needs to insist that we have access to those negotiations, because this now will have a huge impact in terms of our fortunes at the Council. Indeed, it will be a limited engagement that you'll have in the days ahead, because this remains unfulfilled, these negotiations. In terms of the islands communities, they have real concerns about this report, and they have made submissions, and I will forward their submission on to you about their ongoing concerns. They're not enthusiastic people endorsing this report either. So finally, Minister, I'm minded to conclude my contribution by quoting that famous Luke Kelly poem. For what died the sons of Roisin? Was it greed? Will German, French or Dutch inscribe the epitaph of Emmet? When we have sold enough of Ireland to be but strangers in it? For what died the sons of Roisin? Was it greed? Were words ever more appropriate to what is happening in our beloved coastal and fishing communities?
Lascan Corla, I'm not from a fishing community. I don't understand the complexities of the fishing sector. I've never made any pretence that I do. But I have been listening, and I think we all in this House need to listen to what is becoming an endangered species, the Irish fisherman. It is one of the travesties of an island nation that we don't have a world-class fishing fleet, a world-class fishing industry that would inspire pride in all that it does. So it is from that context and from that perspective that I read the Seafood Taskforce report. And in completing its work, the Taskforce described the seafood sector as in the eye of the storm regarding the Brexit fallout. I thought it was a very apt description, because for many sectors, Brexit still even yet looms on the horizon in terms of the impact that it might have. But for our fishing communities and those in the ancillary industries, Brexit has become very tangible very quickly. The Irish fleet, through the agreement, lost 15% of its annual quota. Prawn, monkfish and haddock in particular were impacted. But of course, as Deputy McLaughlin very eloquently outlined, that doesn't even begin to tell the story of what our fishing communities will endure as a result of Brexit. Because it's not 15% of a fair catch. It's 15% of what has been an historically raw deal for our fishing communities for generations. Essentially, I think we need to be big enough and bold enough to say that our fishing communities were sold out upon joining the European Economic Community, and they've been sold out by every government since in their lax attitude to negotiations relating to the fishing industry. And I think that has been evident again in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And of course we support and we recognise more than as much, if not more than anybody, the need to secure a Brexit withdrawal agreement. But the difficulties in terms of the agreement aren't necessarily in terms of what was agreed with the British, because that comes down to hard tax. What was actually agreed within the EU level? And I think that's the part, as again Pádraig McLaughlin has said very clearly, that exposes the fundamental failure within the common fisheries policy. So the Taskforce report that we're debating makes recommendations amounting to €423 million in spending, and we could debate at length the merits of each individual recommendation. But I do think that there is an inherent unfairness, that every time we come looking at a review of this, the proposal always seemed, the default proposal, decommission. Get rid of boats, pay people off. There are a number of other identifiable options that might just be of assistance to our fishing community. So I do think that we need to have quite a bit of thought on that. But the one thing I can say, whenever I've met fishing organisations or watched them come before the committee in this House, and I suppose it's probably true of all of us and everybody, they don't want to be paid to give up their livelihood. They don't want to be paid off, essentially. They want to be able to do what their families for generations have been doing. And yes, I think some will accept decommission and deal if it's on offer. But it's not because they want to abandon their sector. It's because they feel that their government has abandoned them. And I do think that there is a fundamental problem in terms of how we approach this issue. I think historically Irish governments have accepted that fisheries was a battle that they couldn't win. I think too much of this has been left in the hands of a small number of officials. And I don't think we've had a political grasp on our fisheries sector for quite a while ago. I asked you last year, Minister, if you agreed with me that this issue was so profound that we needed a minister with responsibilities for marine. You actually argued something along the lines, it's so important that it should be in the senior minister's desk. We've seen nothing at all, due respect to you, that you have given this and brought this to the level of priority that it needs to be within government. And I can tell you, as opposition spokesperson for your department, the areas relating to agriculture and food are so profound and so important that it is impossible. It's impossible for me as an opposition spokesperson to stay fully on top of that and at the same time deal with what is potentially the most complex issue within any government department. You have a junior minister with responsibility for organics and forestry, things that should be on your desk, that you should be taking control over. I would argue that it would be much more appropriate if there was a minister with direct responsibilities for fisheries. And I think we can see the evidence in terms of the contributions from yourself and from Deputy McLaughlin here today. It does make a difference when somebody is working continually on this issue, knowing the issues inside out, meeting the sectors every single day, engaging with them, finding solutions. You can see it in terms of the articulation of actual policies that will make a difference. And I would say again, and again, this isn't a personal attack on you, because I acknowledge that I don't think anybody has the capacity to deal with the complexities of issues across both farming and fishing. We need to have a minister with a political responsibility and somebody that has the political strength within government to bring this to the heart of government negotiations, because we do need a fundamental reform of the common fisheries policy. It has absolutely failed Ireland. But here's the twist. I accept that if we go into a room that's discussing the common fisheries policy alone, we will not get agreement among other member states for the type of reform that is required. Because most other members have been laughing since the 1970s at the position that Ireland is in. The only way we will actually get the type of reform is if this is brought into the heart of European negotiations around every budget, around every treaty change, around every proposal around financial services, or whatever the case may be. That Ireland setting out as a political priority for our membership and within our membership of the European Union. That if we want to see progress and if we want to see developments happen at an EU level, then fundamental to that must be a change to the fishing policy. So that needs to be led by the head of government as well as by a collective move by government. And the only way that can happen is if there is the political realisation that change needs to happen. And I'm not convinced that that realisation has yet happened.
Deputy Rose
Minister, our fishing industry, as you're well aware, makes a huge contribution to the economic and social fabric of many small communities located around our coastline, not least my own county of Mayo and the coastal area there. But the entire fishing industry feels let down and abandoned. They tell me that every day of the week. They told me today, they told me yesterday, they told me last week. Sinn Féin fully recognise the importance of cooperation at an international level, predominantly through the EU for the sustainable management of fish stocks. That said, the current common fisheries policy is a terrible deal for Ireland and always has been. This has been the result of a litany of historical failures for successive governments to secure a fair deal for our fishing sector. This has been compounded by the disaster of the recent Brexit trade and cooperation agreement, as you know. The agreement saw 199 million worth of EU-wide quotas transferred back to Britain. Around 43 million, essentially a quarter of the total, came at the expense of the fishing sector in this state. The sector here lost 15% of our total quota. The European Commission is in the process of conducting the review, as was discussed, of the Common Fisheries Policy, and that will be presented to the European Council and Parliament at the end of next year. It's vitally important that we have substantial reform. But how can the sector trust the government, given the track record? And that's what they're asking me. I know there's a meeting arranged of government tomorrow where they don't want any other outside voices in it tomorrow morning, which I think is very disappointing as well, because I think we need to be working together. We need to sort this out for the sake of our coastal communities. That's what people expect from us. That's what the fishermen along our coast, and certainly along the coast of Mayo, expect from us. The Seafood Taskforce was established to make recommendations to the Minister on measures to mitigate the impacts of fish quota shares reductions arising from the Trade and Cooperation Agreement on the fishing industry. The report talks about the longer-term fleet restructuring measures through the voluntary permanent cessation schemes, including the inshore sectors. And I want to balance recognising how important the fishing industry is while also underdeveloped by international standards. The fishing fleet operating in Mayo is predominantly the inshore fleet. And while short-term supports for voluntary cessation may be necessary, the idea that the long-term solution is to downsize this sector in Mayo is completely unacceptable. The fishing industry provides an essential source of income for many people in communities along the coast of Mayo, and fishing is one of the few jobs that has sustained communities throughout the tough times. When a state reduces its fleet, it's in a retrograde step. This is the third time we've introduced decommissioning. Fishermen want to fish. They don't want to tie up schemes or decommissioning. They want quota to be allowed, and to be allowed to do the job that they love. They feel totally abandoned and let down by successive Irish governments, and they want a fair distribution. Minister, we need to implement the recommendations of the final report for the very survival of the fishing communities and the coastal communities. But this cannot be the end of it. Unless there's a fairer and more balanced and a viable approach, our communities are going to be decimated. We need a fairer quota system, not only the overall quota system, but how it's distributed as well. And we need to know in places like Éireann, where we don't have processing plants, and I do think that that's a failure of government as well, how that money is going to be spent. You know, can it be spent on piers and infrastructure and other things? In Article 16, it's not been done properly here in Ireland, where how quota is divided out. We have 1,500 vessels, only have less than 50 with mackerel entitlements. One medium vessel has an allocation equal to 1,000 smaller vessels. That isn't right. The unfair distribution of the quota, even the quota as it is, has to be re-looked at. So I hope, Minister, that you're going to take from today what's needed for the coastal communities, because the coastal communities and the fishermen in County Mayo feel absolutely abandoned by this government, and they're not going to be put off with meetings where there is no opposition or where the hard questions aren't asked. We need to all work together. We have a responsibility. You have a responsibility in government, and we and our own spokesperson, Pádraig McLaughlin, has done Trojan work on this. We want to work with you. We want to get it right. We want to get it right, not just for now, but for 10 years' time, 20 years' time, and into generations.
Now the next slot, there's nobody here, and the government slot, there's nobody here, so I'm moving on back to Sinn Féin again. Back to Johnny Maiden.
Minister Ara, one of the things that sticks out the most about this report and the Common Fisheries Policy is the phrase, a level playing field. I would ask where this mythical level playing field is when it comes to the Irish fishing fleet. No other nation had imposed on it a 15% reduction in their nation's fishing quotas, which will a loss of €43 million per year. No other nation had been asked to decommission a major portion of their fleet. No other nation had been offered a voluntary tie-up scheme. Funding schemes are not the answer to fishers, who through decades have built up their modern fleets, built up their small, prosperous coastal communities, and have provided the country with an industry valued at €1.22 billion per annum, with over 16,000 employees. The whole pretext is based on the premise that this will somehow reduce the number of fish caught, and somehow balance the books. All the while, the Belgians, French and Spanish are substantially investing and adding to their fleets, with new super modern trawlers being constructed as we speak. While we sacrifice once again our country's natural resources, allowing other countries to fish with impunity and receive all the benefits of a lucrative global superfood product. There is a saying, no use closing the stable door after the horse has bolted, and I hope and pray this is not the case here. Minister, it is in your hands as a representative of the fishers of Ireland to make sure the burden sharing is proportionate to the quota transfers across the board. It has not gone unnoticed that the first British move on the Brexit negotiations was their claim on territorial waters and using their fishing fleet as a trump card and as a major bargaining leverage in their negotiations. It has not gone unnoticed that the 15% of the quotas have left our fishing industry in a most disadvantaged place. This must be addressed and be rectified in the review of the Common Fisheries Policy, which is due completion by the 31st of December 2022. Minister, a full and comprehensive case must be deployed and acted upon to not only protect what we have, but to invest and grow our fishing, aquaculture and processing industry in a responsible and sustainable way. These are valuable assets that belong to and enriches our nation. It is incomprehensible to see the future of fishers being bought off, processors closing, job losses, in order to facilitate the French, Spanish, Belgians and others in reaping the rewards of our fishing waters for many years to come. Meanwhile, our own fishing boats are decommissioned and tied to the piers. I implore all stakeholders to put forward their case in a strong and bold manner, because the clock is ticking and there is no time to lose, and the stakes are high for the sustainability and future of our fishing communities, like Kilmore, Rosslare, Slane and Duncannon in my own county of Wexford.
And now I'm moving on to Social Democrats. Holly Cairns.
Minister, the report sets out the stark reality faced by the Irish fishing sector, which is in the eye of the storm that is Brexit. In the hundreds of headlines and news reports on Brexit, fishing isn't mentioned enough. Despite the massive impact and the ongoing change, coastal and island communities' whole livelihoods depend on the sea, and they're often overlooked. The Irish fleet has lost over 15% of its annual quota, which is compounded by supply chain disruption to and from the UK, as well as transport links with continental Europe. The key issue here is one of imbalances. The report highlights the imbalances between the fleet capacity and resource availability as a result of the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Then there is the imbalance in the distribution of the decreasing Irish quota, with the inshore sector getting disgracefully low allowances in some cases. Brexit is an incredible challenge for fishing and seafood, but now what we can do is see it as an opportunity to recognise and set out policies that will guarantee the sustainability of coastal and island communities. Our fishing quota is a public resource. It has to be distributed equitably between smaller vessels and operators and larger players. Any schemes or measures to counter the Brexit impact cannot be allowed to enforce current imbalances. The loss of fishing opportunities is being felt by all fishers, and any response must not only recognise this, but also adjust historic and existing disparities. The closure of the Artisan hook and line fishery for mackerel for vessels under 15 metre in length in June is a very clear example of the inequality. The 2% of the quota assigned to the inshore sector ran out halfway through the year, leaving over 2,000 boats, almost 2,000 families, without access to this type of fishing. At the same time, 98% of that quota is allocated to just 49 boats. This was raised in June. I highlighted this injustice with you then, Minister, and nothing has happened. Since then, the smallest of vessels, who are just trying to get by, were not permitted to catch even a few dozen mackerel for sale at the likes of a farmer's market, using a fishing method which we all know is probably the most environmentally friendly of all. Why is our fishing regime set up to benefit a few big players and not the majority of fishers? It's similar to our agriculture policy, pretty much just like our housing policy and our health one. The same story unfolds. Not to mention that this policy choice contradicts Article 17 of the Common Fishery Policy that states the allocation of quota must be based on environmental, social and economic benefits. Where is the evidence of that in Ireland's policy? And the policy preamble, which specifically mentions the small-scale offshore islands which are dependent on fishing, should be especially recognised in order to enable them to survive and prosper. Our inshore fisheries are more environmentally friendly. They practice the kind of fishing found in coastal and island communities for centuries. This is where the vast majority of employment is in the sector. This is the segment that should get the most support, get at least a fair allocation of quotas and funding. The submission of the Islands Marine Resource Organisation, now PO, makes very clear recommendations which need to be met if the Minister and the Department are serious and genuine about supporting inshore fishers. These include a flat rate payment for all registered vessels 12 metres and under, vessels between 12 and 18 metres which do not qualify for supports under other BAR measures should be supported under a similar scheme, and the issue of access to fishing opportunities by the National Fleet to be examined by a formal public consultation in light of the decreases in quota. These are also sensible and important actions that the government can and obviously should take. Piers and marine infrastructure are vital to facilitating the seafood sector, and I welcome the report's acknowledgement of this. It states that public marine infrastructure, like piers, slipways and pontoons, etc., is a critical enabler to maximising the use and benefits to be gained from our rich marine resources. And it makes a recommendation of an 80 million five-year initiative for the development of these features. This isn't only obviously vital funding and so needed, it will reap multiple benefits for the fishing, recreation and tourism sectors, which will generate considerably more for local economies. However, this funding must be in addition to existing investment in piers and slipways, because I think everybody will note from a coastal area, current resources for this area are vastly inadequate. The government needs to recognise that and provide fresh investment, not relabel existing measures. I hope that makes sense. I've continuously raised the need to fund our small piers as vital infrastructure for inshore fishing. A pier or a bay on an island can support 10 or 20 families. It can keep people in rural areas and on our islands. In West Cork, there are so many examples of piers like this where there's so many people who are fishing off them. That's employment for a lot of people. The likes of Dunmanus, Colla, Durras, Allihies, Turkhead, the list goes on, Minister. All of them need investments. Too many small piers dotted around our coastline and islands are falling into disrepair and lack the very, very basic amenities like slipways. Islands must also be recognised in this category. They require basic infrastructure if they are to participate effectively in a sustainable fishing industry into the future. The Minister needs to support the development of a network of onshore infrastructure and offshore islands to facilitate the island fishing fleet and shore-based seafood collectors. Given the limited range of small vessels and their vulnerability to weather conditions, offshore islands should be equipped with combined landing, storage, processing and retail units to facilitate short fishery supply chains and the adding of value to catches. The Taskforce outlines the case for investment in public marine infrastructure. The government needs to implement this and to ensure that small piers and islands get the investment that they really desperately need. And Minister, I remember that when I was in Cork County Council, and I spoke to you about it before, that like at the Coastal Management Committee meeting, we basically ended up just talking about how could we get more funding rather than talking about what projects in Cork needed funding, because there was no money there for them. And there's no point in everybody going in and fighting for their own local pier. There needs to be enough funding for more of them, at least. Different representative organisations have also raised concerns that must be addressed. The Irish Fishing and Seafood Alliance have highlighted the lack of clarity regarding how much of the recommended measures will come from the EU Brexit Fund. There's also confusion whether those applying for decommissioning would have to refund any tie-up scheme payments they received. While the Irish South and West Fish PO has pointed out the inadequacies of the proposed decommission scheme. Finally, Minister, this discussion is not only about seafood but the future of our coastal and island communities as a whole. It's about families and whole cohorts that were dependent on this sector, including culinary and environmental tourism. There is a glaring need for a citizens' assembly on our maritime future. The legislative framework around marine planning and development is rapidly changing with vastly insufficient input from the communities affected. Now, Brexit has underscored the inequalities of our quota and funding allocations. We're still awaiting an offshore islands policy, and massive sections of marine zones are going to become protected areas. So we need to have a very clear understanding of how this all fits together. We need to have a vision for the future of our coast. So I urge you to convene a Citizens' Assembly on this next year. The Seafood Sector Taskforce report is an enormous opportunity, I think, to set up a fairer policy which recognises the inshore sector, supports coastal and island communities, and it's now up to the government to make that happen. Thank you.
I would agree with an awful lot of what has been said. Here we are dealing with the Seafood Task Force, the final report. It obviously lays things out starkly in relation to where the fishing industry is, and beyond that, I suppose, those communities that lie behind the fishing industry. And we've had many reports on many issues over many years, and we haven't necessarily done anything other than bind them and present them well, and not do the business and the due diligence that's required. Look, I think it's fair to say that fishing communities across this island, even, as I say, within my own constituency, whether we're talking about Clagherhead or beyond, and I know the Minister has had, you know, a number of interactions with fishermen, and realises, or at least has had it stated to him, the difficulties that they are dealing with. We know what has already been said here in relation to what we could be looking at of the reductions in fleet. We know that Brexit is the gift that never stops giving, that following the TCA we have a 15% reduction in relation to the quota. We know that 30% of the fish that are landed within Irish territorial waters literally go to the Irish fishing industry, that we have huge difficulties in relation to this. And I suppose we can break it down to the three major asks, for the want of a better term, of this particular report, and straight away too much burden is being put on the Irish fishing industry. We know that there are, number two, that there are huge issues in relation to the financing, the funding streams and the rules around that. We need that to be absolutely updated and a fit-for-purpose system. But beyond that, I suppose we're dealing with here, number three, the major issue of them all is that, and I've heard it reported here, and I've even used the term myself, and I'm going to use it again, when we talk about the common fisheries policy, is the fact, and we talk even of the Brexit negotiations and the TCA this time, that once again the fishing industry and the Irish fishing industry was the whipping boy, and it's where the defence wasn't sufficiently made and where the pain is felt. As I say, like, we were starting from a bad place and we end up in a reduction in relation to the quota by, you know what I mean, by 15%. What we really need to happen most of all is, when the opportunity now arises in relation to the renegotiation of quotas and the CFP, is that we need to invest greatly in relation to getting delivery here. Of course, there are many people who will want to avail of particular funding as regards decommissioning and whatever, and that's fine. But we need to look at the overall fishing industry, that we have a fishing industry that's able to deliver for us, able to deliver into the future, obviously as a stream of healthy food, but even beyond that, as I say, we need to look at the impact and the positive impact that the fishing industry has had in our communities. And look, it would be very difficult to talk about this and the whole issue we're dealing with as regards Brexit, and particularly today when we look at just the utter madness that we're dealing with as regards a British government who, I think it's fair we could all say, don't care in any which way about Ireland. That's the only thing you can take. And we have the absolute madness at this point in time of the fact that we could be talking about these new British immigration laws that could see non-Irish EU citizens living in the south needing to apply online for pre-travel clearance in order to cross the border. And this could be an issue of them literally crossing the border and crossing back to get to work, you know, leaving from the south to end up back in the south. Like, it's just utterly unworkable, and it once again shows how Britain, in any of its determinations and its negotiations around Brexit, doesn't care in any way, shape or form about Ireland, doesn't care about the North, only cares about it as a pawn, and it is something that we need to be absolutely solid and firm about. It's also an issue that I brought up yesterday with Maros Sefcovic, and the impact that this is going to have into the future. I think it's fair to say everybody here is in agreement that we need to be solid. The Irish Protocol is the only show in town, and there can be no return of a hard border. But to return to the issue at hand, we have an opportunity now to follow through in relation to this task force, and first and foremost is a renegotiation of the CFP.
Thank you very much, Deputy O'Maracu. Now we go to Chapter E. Watercoo. Deputy Verona Murphy, please.
Thank you, Chair. The issues facing our fishing industries are many in number, and it would be impossible to mention or discuss all of the problems which fishermen have raised with me in the context of this report, but I'll do my best, Minister. Looking at the Seafood Task Force report, the executive summary, a couple of paragraphs jump out at me. It says the Irish seafood sector is, in many ways, in the eye of the storm. It's been shaped by the common experience of EU membership alongside the UK, since both joined the EC as it was then in 1973. Irish boats fished and shared waters in the English Channel or off Scotland and Killybegs. Trawlers became familiar sights in ports of Ullapool and Lerwick in the Shetland Islands. The Brexit TCA deal has brought a sudden and a dramatic shift in the landscape of the entire Irish seafood sector in a number of respects. The Irish fleet has lost access to 15% of annual quota, mainly affecting pelagic stocks, prawns and white fish stocks such as megrim, monkfish and haddock. Irish seafood exports to the UK, a key market worth 80 million pre-Brexit, are severely impacted. Irish seafood imports from the UK, worth 219 million in 2018, a key input to the Irish retail and processing supply chain, have been disrupted. Vital seafood export routes, primarily the land bridge via the UK, have been curtailed. Established Irish-UK links at scientific and policy levels in the EU and ICES have been lost. The ICES. The key question arising from this is, of course, what are we going to do about it? And how are we going to protect our fishing industry from further harm and devastation? Burden sharing is an often spoken phrase when it comes to fishing. Such an apt name, because so many burdens have been placed on the Irish fishing sector. It's not reward sharing, it's burden sharing. And surely the spirit of the EU is to help people, not to place burdens upon them. The common fisheries policy is an outdated, severe burden on our Irish fishermen and women. To quote again directly from the report, Ireland contributed about 15% of the total value of our total 2020 fisheries quota to the agreement. Proportionally, this is substantially more than that of any other member state impacted by the TCA. Again, we see that it is the Irish fishers who pay the heaviest price. The Irish government owes it to the Irish fishing industry to do all it can to create the conditions for our fishing industry to thrive. We made many concessions in order to get an EU agreement over the line. Our fishermen were neglected. The on-level playing field is another major concern of fishermen that I have mentioned previously in debates here in the Fisheries Bill. Some of what I said then needs to be repeated because it's still causing significant anger amongst those in the industry and, moreover, particularly in our Wexford ports. An Irish citizen who commits an infringement in Irish waters will have penalty points applied by the Irish authorities. Yet, when a foreign master commits an infringement in Irish waters, they will not have penalty points applied by the Irish authorities. All we can do is notify the authority in their country of origin. That's if they were to be inspected at all. We should have the opportunity to police our own waters as we see fit, rather than only being able to refer offences to other jurisdictions. It's a fundamental issue of sovereignty over our own affairs, and whilst Ireland has seen many benefits from our membership of the EU, our sovereignty over things such as our fishing rights has been steadily eroded away to the detriment of Irish fishers. We do not have a level playing field, Minister. It seems we're not currently able to police our own waters, and we do not have the right to punish offenders in our own waters, a very concerning state of affairs. I know there is an urgent need for a review of the common fisheries policy. If ever these issues are to be dealt with to deliver a policy for how we fish today, but not 50 years ago. The report says that the Minister has set down that Ireland is seeking a comprehensive review to inform a full reform of the current policy. He has made it clear that the Common Fisheries Policy Review must take stock of the disproportionate impacts imposed on the Irish fishing industry by Brexit and the TCA. He also made clear that Ireland will be seeking to address the imbalance in the quota transfers of the TCA, and I have heard you say that myself, Minister. And I welcome the news, and I sincerely hope that it isn't an empty promise on your behalf. We need to stand firm on this during negotiations and debates. I wish you well in this work, because the fishing sector, they're absolutely relying on you. And all they want, Minister, is a fair deal in order for Irish fishers and fishermen and women to be sustainable, just a level playing field. And from the 1st of April, certain Irish fishing boats, many based in County Wexford, have not been allowed to land their catch in UK ports. They've had to use an EU port instead, adding extra time and costs to their journeys, plus the added costs of getting their catch back to Ireland. Hundreds of extra nautical miles, hundreds of extra kilometres to earn their living and help their communities to survive, with adding risk to life and limb. It also results in greater levels of emissions, which the government seem to be only concerned with at some level. This burden of not being able to land a catch in UK ports wouldn't have been quite as bad, except for the fact that we offered 5 extra landing ports in Ireland to facilitate foreign registered fishing vessels, to land their catches here. So we bent over backwards to accommodate people we have no responsibility for, and yet our fishermen feel cast to one side. And finally, Ceann Comhairle, I want to raise the issue of salmon drift net fishing, a forgotten sector, and Minister, one that I have discussed with you briefly. But back in 2005, the sector was effectively closed down, using the guise of protecting fish stocks. In 2006, a 25 million decommissioning scheme or hardship scheme was introduced, and only those who agreed not to reapply for their licences were compensated for the loss of livelihood. A response to a PQ I submitted a few weeks ago said that 1,046 licence holders availed of the hardship scheme. There were a number of licence holders who decided against applying for the scheme, as they wanted to be able to resume fishing in the future, and many had done for decades beforehand, and they were assured that they could. Now, 16 years later, they still have not been allowed to resume their fishing activity. In some instances, people have been stripped of their livelihood and prevented from engaging in the activity of salmon drift fishing for 16 years. Minister, government has a responsibility to these people. And the PQ response said that there were now only 79 people with still active licences in 2021. Now, that might be a relatively small number, but it's still 79 people without their opportunity to earn a living, if it be from salmon drift net fishing. and it has impacted far more than just the 79 people who hold the licence. It's impacted their families if we take it into account that it was at one point their actual livelihood. And in light of that fact, in light of the fact that this fishing has been banned for an unforeseeably long length of time, I can only assume that in 2005 it was expected to last for possibly a year or two. But Minister, should we not now permit that there are only 79 licence holders? Can we not reinstate their right to fish? Because if we're not going to do that, I think we do have to compensate them, Ceann Comhairle. I think fair is fair. When the fishing was stopped for these people, there was well over 1,100 licences active. And again, Minister, now there's only 79. And they deserve better from government than to be just cast aside and ignored. So it is their opinion that government don't care, as these are only 79 votes. Now, I don't wish to believe that, either on the floor or in any guise, that we would cast any group aside because of a vote. And what I would ask you, Minister, is to consider on that basis how we would deal with the 79 licence holders going forward. And if the resumption of the fishing isn't possible, then a hardship scheme should be reintroduced to take care of that. Thank you, Ceann Comhairle.
Thank you very much, Deputy Murphy. Deputy Michael Collins.
Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. One of the major recommendations from the Taskforce interim report is that a one-month-long voluntary temporary cessation scheme will be offered to 220 whitefish vessels impacted by the quota reductions in the period from September to December. Fishermen have been raising their concerns about their industry long before the Brexit trade deal was signed before Christmas 2020, but all concerns put forward by the entire sector have been ignored by the Minister. The Minister's actions have seriously disadvantaged the Irish fishing sector. This has been compounded by the EU ruling that means fish need to be weighed on piers. The greatest thing that is required for the fishing industry is for the government to develop a backbone and a willingness to fight at European level to save the Irish fishing industry from decimation. That is the one element that's consistently missing from over the last 48 years of our membership of the EU. Successive governments have been completely subservient to every rule, regulation or guideline that has ever come from the European Union. And successive governments have failed to recognise the true potential of the Irish fishing industry. The Seafood Taskforce report is a complete distraction from the real impacts of Brexit. It also is a deeply cynical move by the government, who failed the sector during the Brexit negotiations, to compound its own failings now further by seeking to decommission large portions of the Irish fleet. All talks now is for share burdening. Where were the talks 12 months ago? Where were the talks a year and a half ago about share burdening? Instead, the Brexit trade deal must and should be revisited. The common fisheries policy, which is up for renewal shortly, must also be used to get a better deal for Irish fishers. Under this Minister's policy on fisheries, some boats are tied up for long periods due to lack of quota, and bigger boats could be tied up 6 months of the year now. The same Minister wants to put fishermen and women completely out of existence via this report's recommendations. The Brexit deal and the withdrawal of the weighing derogation were two straws that really broke the camel's back within the Irish fishing sector. Brexit took away 15% of their already minimal quotas, and that's a really hard blow to the industry. It equated to 25% of the industry's income, so that's every year forevermore. Those fish are gone to the UK, around the Irish coast. We only have 7.5% of monkfish quota, and in Hague we only have 3%, so it's very low. The EU granted 199 million fish to the UK as part of the Brexit trade deal, and out of that 199 million, Ireland had to give 43 million worth of fish. We consider that to be desperately unfair. The sector is being slashed by at least an annual 43 million cut, simply due to government sellout. This will impact the sector every single year. Myself and my colleagues in the Rural Independent Group highlighted this earlier this year, how the evidence illustrates that our Fisheries Minister and the government blindly allowed Brussels to give away Irish fishing quota during crucial Brexit negotiations. negotiations. In doing so, they have betrayed not only the sector and the coastal communities, but the entire country. The Minister for Agriculture, Food and the Marine, Charlie McConalogue, sold out the Irish fishing industry during Brexit negotiations. When I raised these issues on the floor of Dáil on numerous occasions earlier this year with the Taoiseach and last year, the Taoiseach's response was flabbergasting and deflective in nature. The Taoiseach chose to take a defensive and elusive tone which lacked any acknowledgement of the extent of the destruction by this government to the Irish fishing sector. Clearly, the Taoiseach's response indicates a deep and uncaring lack of understanding for the sector. This was previously demonstrated when he signed into law a highly destructive penalty point system when he was caretaker Minister for Agriculture in August 2020. Replies I have obtained from a series of parliamentary questions to confirm that the government blindly supported the EU negotiations and mandate in respect of the Brexit negotiations. This provides infuriating confirmation, which means the Irish fishing industry must now pay the price for our governments opting to toe the Brussels line in the Brexit negotiations. The shocking and utter lack of engagement and dialogue with the EU side on behalf of the Irish fishery sectors by you, Minister, in the months leading up to the Brexit deal is now glaringly obvious. In fact, at your first meeting of the Agriculture and Fisheries Council on the 21st of September 2020, you, Minister, failed to raise the Irish sector's pre-Brexit concerns. At your second meeting since becoming Minister on the 19th and 20th of October 2020, you again failed to table or raise discussions on the Brexit fisheries implications for Ireland. Instead, you choose to engage in a rather meaningless three-way bilateral meeting with Fisheries Minister from France, Denmark and the Netherlands. Yet again, at your third EU fisheries meeting on the 16th of November 2020, no fisheries item whatsoever were raised. One would be forgiven for wondering what has been discussed at such fisheries meetings. Further meetings attended by you, Minister, on the 27th of November and on the 15th and 16th of December, where the Brexit fisheries element of negotiations were discussed, point to the Minister acting as a protector of European quota interests rather than a protector of the Irish share of the quota. All in all, this new information serves to illustrate the complete blindness to which the Minister and the Government entrusted the EU negotiators with. It also clearly demonstrates that the Minister and the Government strategically and deliberately choose not to stand up for Irish fishing industry interests. Instead, they sought the praise from the Brussels elite. Sadly, at a time when Irish fishermen were depending solely on the Irish Government to protect their interests, it did not occur. In an overall context, data from Dublin City University estimates Ireland's share of the total fish catch in the Irish maritime zone is at only 15 or 16%. This means that the other 85% are caught by foreign vessels. The Brexit fisheries deal means that Irish vessels are hit with massive quota reductions in neighbouring UK waters, also while other EU countries got sweet deals, despite the fact that foreign vessels continue to extract 85% of fish from Irish waters. We now have a government who is hell-bent on forging ahead with a wide-scale decommissioning of the Irish fleet, dressed up as some sort of a review process and contained within this report. And it is evident, Minister, that none of your colleagues from Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael or the Greens are in here today to back you up on this stinking deal for the Irish fishermen. Decommission them, get rid of them is your plan. All the while foreign vessels will be allowed to continue fishing our waters. It is no wonder Irish fishing and coastal communities rightly feel let down by this government. The sector was only seeking a fair distribution of quota. Nothing more, nothing less. They were betrayed in that request. The government should have made their decision to adopt a much tougher stand during the Brexit negotiations. The Taoiseach repeatedly failed miserably to clarify why he and his Minister for Agriculture, Food and the Marine choose to let the Irish fishing sector down. This arrogant and enough attitude cannot be tolerated, as it is destroying the livelihoods of our fishermen and women, while also destroying coastal community, and has us now on our knees with a begging bowl in front of Europe. The only solution being offered by the government is a public relations exercise dressed up as a pathetic review after the fact. This review has one long-term objective. This is to decommission a large volume of Irish vessels. And as a TD who has consistently stood shoulder to shoulder with our fishing industry, I will not be accepting this hoodwinking approach. I will continue to fight every day for our fishermen and fishermen women. Therefore, I am now again calling on you, Minister, and the Taoiseach, to go back to Brussels and seek a greater share of the quota for the Irish fishing vessels. Currently 16% of the Irish maritime zone, in order to make up for the mess created by your own inactions. Failure by the government to take this course will result in a decommissioned Irish fleet, which almost all fish in Irish waters being caught by foreign vessels due to lazy policies by a Fianna Fáil Taoiseach and his Minister and TDs with the support of Fine Gael and the Greens. Minister, what are the species landed by the Irish fleet that make up the 35% of landing you spoke about earlier? Do you know the tonnes this amounts to? Are you telling the full amount caught in Irish waters by every fishing boat of the EU was 300,000 tonnes? Within the Marine Institute, when the Marine Institute said there was 3.7 million tonnes caught by the EU vessels in 2020. Minister, we have less than 1% of the fish caught in Europe. Whoever wrote your report and that speech, Minister, should be retired. Are you aware, Minister, that the EU Commission has written to the SFP asking them in relation to the breaches of landing and obligations? They are threatening to withdraw millions of funding from our national naval services. Is there anyone listening to the industry calling for a level playing pitch? Why are foreign boats sailing in and out of our ports with little or no monitoring of our activities, while our fleet will soon, imagine, be putting some seats into their boats for the inspectors? There's so many on board so often. We lost access to rockall and 5 million of squid are gone. Where have you covered this in your report, Minister? And an additional month tie-up is being proposed, but this means no fishing, no earnings from other species. This is a little or no help. There's a lot of issues, Minister, that I could address here today. The inshore sector have been badly hit as well and are very on their knees also. Coastal and island communities are going to be hit terribly here. There is no compensation can compensate the fact that you lose your livelihood. People that fish the sea day and night and went out in rough times so to bring food to the people's plate in this country. And this government, no TD from Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Greens showed up here today. A scandalous sign and a scandalous statement by them that they don't support what you're putting before us today, and I certainly don't. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Collins. Deputy Fitzmaurice.
Margaret Karen Corla, and I welcome the opportunity to speak on this. I'm not going to claim that I would be as knowledgeable as a lot of people that would live on the coastal areas about fishing, but my analysis of a lot of this is, in my opinion, driven by bad EU policy down through the years. We seem to be going into as a country, but Europe as a combination of nations, that we want the big monopoly to do everything. And I say that when I look at, one time ago, a builder building houses was able to go up to the council and tender for 3, 4, 5 houses and build it. And now, if it's an area being done, the bonds they have won't be big enough, the turnover won't be big enough, and they're basically, unless you're the big builder that's getting your funding from somewhere out abroad, you're not considered because you happen to turnover. If you look at the HSE, it's gone down the same road. The one supplier to do all, the big guru that will have it all. If you look at roads right around the country, the thresholds of turnovers is unbelievable. If you look at Irish water, there's, one time ago, group water schemes, we used to have a saying down the country, a tractor in the transport box, you'd one for it, and a digger, and a couple of people. And now you're getting a region. And if your turnover isn't big enough for that, even though you might have done the jobs down through the years for the 100 houses, the 150 houses, or whatever, you are now too small, so you're being shoved into a corner that you're a subby. And you have to sub off them that's able to control a whole area. And what it appears to be under all EU legislation, that they want you to be dealing with one person, goes out to tender on that, goes on turnover, and bye-bye. And the sad reality of this, no more than in the fishing sector, that then we had companies that came from Spain and other parts of the world, tendering for work here, that it wasn't very favourable, some of the outcomes of it, I'll put it that way. And it's leaving Irish people scratching their head. When you listen about the fishing and the Brexit deal and all of that, and what's some of the stuff being proposed, decommissioning is taking people away from the work they were at, to put it very simple. Decommissioning is people having to sell the boat they have, being offered a few measly pounds. And you know what to remind you of? The time of the beat in Ireland, where farmers were sold a pup, to put it very clearly. And why are we as a country constantly letting out or stopping doing things that give a living to people, but also in hindsight, when we look back, we say, geez, that was a bad idea. We should never have done that. We've left ourselves exposed. And case point would be that at the moment, have a look at Europe. We're like a little bird within the nest with our beaks open because we're waiting for gas, or we'll perish to death. We are in the line of fertiliser, the dead same. We are relying on countries that they're basically sparring with, the likes of Russia and that. They're trying to kick Russia into the mouth, but at the same time we want their gas. And there's tariffs put on things. And the whole exercise of what Europe is at the moment, I think has to be questioned. The only thing that the penny might have dropped with them is on the farming sector. And Minister, I've said before, I support you in your convergence. But in 00 or 99, 'twas punch as many bullocks as you could at 9 months and 18 months. And the more land you had and the more bullocks you had, the bigger your payment was. But the small fella or lady in a part of the country that had their 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 acres, that had their few cows, wouldn't have the money, first of all, to do this. And they ended up at the bottom of the ladder. And that's why we have lost so many farmers in the farming sector, because the poor devils, it became unviable. And we seem to now start, and it's not fair enough in my opinion, Europe seems to be driving this big commercial operator, the big commercial farmer, the big commercial fisherman, the big commercial builder, one of them in each sector, the way that sort of when the invoices comes in, you don't have to be looking at 40 little subbies that are torturing you or ringing you, you just look at one. And that's not the way that you build communities. When Europe started off, it was a community, the greatest thing that ever was. But we seem to be heading to what they want, or what they call a physical union. It's like marriage. It's either love or divorce, one or the other. And Europe needs to have a ferocious rethink, for the simple reason Ireland has one of the, I think actually the biggest fishing waters in Europe is owned by Ireland. And we seem to have got the worst part of that, not in your time, Minister, but before that, when the deal was being doctored out. We got a ferocious bad deal. And now with Brexit, and with the tightening that's coming in trying to basically share out the little bit of fish that's left in the waters that we're talking about, other countries are looking for it as well. We're being blocked from going over there. So our people in our waters with our fish is the big loser. And the sad part about it is, and as I say, I'm no expert in fishing, but I watch what's going on. I watched a ship that came from Australia and it fishing out in the waters. And to gulp more in 15 minutes than I'd say 200 fishing boats that we'd have gone out of our little ports. But the difference is that the 200 little fishing boats that goes out from our little ports is 200 families living in 200 areas, helping 200 communities and other people in business. And we don't seem to get this into our head. And I hate to hear the word decommission, because it's basically no more than the likes of Bordnamona. Just look at that. Bordnamona, the palaver comes out in the PR and all the BS, I call it, that they'll talk about we created this and we created that and we created the other. Have a look how many was working 7 years ago, how many was looking today. That's how you add up whether people are better off or worse off. Not, well, we have this coming in and we're going to re-wet this and we're going to do this, that and the other. Absolutely BS. The gurus at media, what they can say is unbelievable. And I think, Minister, we have to stand up for the Irish fisher people. I was talking to Holly Kearns yesterday evening, and she's from a fishing area, small fishing boats, and she was saying the infrastructure that they need, they never got it to help them in their area. And we should make sure that, be it Donegal or be it down to Kinsale or wherever you want to go, or Wexford, or all the different ports, that we give the infrastructure to the smaller communities to make sure that they'll be able to do what they can. And I'm listening to Deputy Collins talking about putting in a seat. It's a damn thing if you have to go putting in a seat for someone else to join you to basically shaft you within in the boat. And I think, Minister, we have to stand up for rural communities on the periphery of, they're on the edge of, they're on the coast. They, in my opinion, are as important as someone in any other part of Ireland. And we have to watch that the likes of Europe isn't trying to basically bully us into situations to do a horse deal on something. Do you sacrifice one thing for the other? I know there will be always trading, but it's a sad day that if we own most of the fishing water that's in Europe, or the biggest area of it, I'll put it that way, and we're coming out with the worst part of the deal. And then you have to look at other things where fishermen, and I've seen it already in parts of the country, and everyone welcomes new technology and new stuff, but you liaise with people and work with them. I saw lobster pots and all of that where you were bringing in cables, and basically they were told you to get out of the way or we'll drive through you. That's not the way you work with people that has been in communities for years and years. And I would ask you, Minister, that some of these foreign ministers that barely have they haven't a pond in their areas, not a mind a bit of sea, that they shouldn't be entitled to be making decisions for us that has a big area. And, you know, we have a common travel area with the Brits for flying, and I'm damn sure that, you know, we can do something ourselves. Whatever about Europe, I always believe, look after your own and let the rest look after themselves, would be my honest opinion.
Thank you, Deputy.
And we need to make sure that we look after our fishermen and women around the country.
Thank you, Deputy Fitzmaurice. Minister McConalogue.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cian Corla, and I'd like to thank all the various speakers for their contribution today to this very important debate. It's obviously an important time and moment, and has been a really crucial year, and for our fishing sector, and it was one which was a very difficult year for fishermen coming out of the impact of the Brexit agreement, and it was really important today, I think, that we had this debate to discuss the Sea Fisheries Taskforce report, which was presented to me in October, and indeed to get deputies' views in relation to it today. I want to thank the Sinn Féin deputies who contributed, and also Deputy Cairns and Deputy Murphy, Deputy Collins and Deputy Fitzmaurice as well. A couple of points I'd make overall just in relation to the contributions. First of all, I know we had a number of Sinn Féin speakers who spoke, and even after all of that time and all of those contributions, I still am none the wiser as to whether Sinn Féin support the Sea Fisheries Taskforce report or they don't. I have no idea. I listened carefully to all the contributions, and I haven't a clue what their position is. Don't think they know themselves, but it's certainly not clear to anyone that have been listening into the debate today, so maybe it's something they might clarify in due course. I think certainly my objective over the course of the last year, and indeed in advance of Brexit, has been to support our fishers in every way possible, and that has been, I've been fully supported in that by my government colleagues as well, both in advance of Brexit in terms of protecting us against the threat that it posed, the very fundamental threat to fishers' livelihoods, and subsequent to that in relation to the damage that agreement actually did. And we all knew the threat that Brexit posed to our fishing sector. It was never going to be a good story. It was always about protecting the sector in every way we could against it. And I find it ironic, Cian Corla, to have particularly the Sinn Féin deputies stand up here this evening talking about standing up for fishermen and doing their working hard for fishermen, when I recall back to whenever Brexit was happening. As you recall, the Brexit deal finally happened on Christmas Eve last year, 24th. It was Thursday, 24th of December. I remember actually the news broke the previous weekend as to what may be in it from a fisher's point of view and how damaging that might be. There was very significant efforts going on within government to push back on that. And indeed afterwards, we barely had, I remember on Christmas Day, our officials in Brussels were working in Brussels on dealing with the outcome of the agreement. I remember the day after Stephen's Day, myself and the Taoiseach and the Minister for Foreign Affairs meeting with fisher representatives to discuss the very stark implications of the agreement for us. Despite Sinn Féin party here now talking about standing up for fishermen, there wasn't a word out of them over that period of time about fishing. Not a word. Despite the fundamental moment that was for our fishing sector. We as a government were standing up in every way we could. There wasn't even a word out of them. They say the weekend before Christmas it became clear what the implications might be. Not a word. Christmas Eve, not a word. It was into the new year before there was any comment from a Sinn Féin statement or from a Sinn Féin spokesperson about the impact that Brexit had on fishing. But yet, once the water calmed and once the storm passed and once it was safe to come back out, they're out talking about standing up for fishermen again. So it's a bit ironic to listen to the comments now whenever they were nowhere to be seen at that pivotal moment. So at least we know Deputy Collins was very clear that he doesn't support the Taskforce report. He's absolutely clear in that. The Taskforce report was put together by stakeholders, by fishers themselves. It's a really pivotal moment for our fishing sector. So I brought together the fishing stakeholders to advise me as Minister on how we can best support, as a government, the fishing sector now to address the implications of Brexit, to fight at European level in relation to how we fight on their behalf, and also to address the implications coming out of that in terms of the impact on quotas. And those fishing stakeholders, fisher representatives, co-op representatives, have put together that report and those many recommendations advising me and advising the government as to how we can best support that sector. So I note that Deputy Collins doesn't support their recommendations and doesn't support the seafood task force report put together by those same stakeholders whose livelihoods depends on it. So, but at least Deputy Collins is at least Deputy Collins is clear on his position in that regard, unlike some other deputies. But I want to, across the board, thank those for the many contributions that we received, or that were made here this evening. So, Cian Corla, in establishing the task force earlier this year, I very much strongly believed that that's once in a generation event, such as the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. It required a collective response involving the sectors and communities most affected. And for those reasons, as I said, I set it up in a way that there were 17 representatives of the sectors and communities impacted by Brexit on the task force, together as well with state enterprise development agencies. And I received that final task force report then on the 11th of October. And I do want to compliment the task force on an exceptional job, the exceptional job that it did in identifying the impacts of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement on our fishing fleet and coastal communities, and indeed in proposing an integrated plan to mitigate those impacts and set those communities back on a path to prosperity. The report recommends 16 support schemes at a total estimated cost of €423 million, and perhaps in the region of €300 million of that could be potentially eligible through the bar, and identifies a number of high-level impacts arising from the TCA that I would like to recall. So firstly, the TCA quota reductions and having created an economic imbalance between fleet capacity and fishing opportunities, rendering the whitefish fleet unprofitable. Secondly, the TCA quota cuts having caused a significant loss of raw material supply to our vibrant seafood processing sector. The loss of that raw material supply to our processors, risking these processors losing hard-won markets, and risks also reducing their profitability and risks loss of employment in coastal communities. Thirdly, while large parts of the inshore sector have not been directly impacted by the quota transfers under the TCA, many have been impacted by route-to-market issues and increased operating costs, which compound other weaknesses in the sector. And fourthly, the combination of impacts from the Trade and Cooperation Agreement risks significant loss of employment and economic value in coastal communities. So, coming out of that, the Taskforce report sets out an integrated plan to mitigate these four core impacts and other consequent effects on the TCA. As discussed, firstly, in relation to the whitefish fleet, returning it to profitability, the proposal in relation to a decommissioning scheme. Secondly, as well, then in relation to supporting the processors with the loss of raw material, proposing direct investment in seafood processing companies. Thirdly, in terms of addressing the impact on the inshore fleet, recommending a decommissioning scheme for the inshore fleet, and also assessment of ways to remove inactive vessels from the inshore fleet. And finally, then, in a combination with the investment in seafood processors and aquaculture enterprises, proposing investment to diversify the economies of our coastal communities through a combination of investment in public and in public marine infrastructure, and indeed community-led local development through our flags. So, overall, Cion Corla, I think that the Seafood Taskforce report is one that is really comprehensive, deals with this once-in-a-generation impact, outlines how I can and supports how I have been, many of the measures I already have been taking at European level to try and improve our quota situation, to address that burden sharing outcome from TCA, which has been so impactful and damaging to our sector, and also really importantly then to invest in our sector to maximise its capacity to create employment, to maintain employment, and to support coastal communities over the next number of years. And I once again want to thank Aidan Cotter as Chair, Margaret Daly and Micheál Cinnéide as the steering force members, and the many stakeholders from our fishing communities and fishing representatives who put massive time and effort and full days meetings on many occasions is what they had to actually put together this comprehensive response looking at all aspects as to how we as a government can support them in the time ahead. And I will continue to work my way through those recommendations and to do all I can to support our fishing sector and our fishers both at European level and national level in the time ahead.
Thank you very much, Minister.
One of the organisations, the Irish Southwest Organisation, have rejected part of that report, and you failed to recognise that, Minister. The part of the decommissioning that I will reject the same report on the same reasons. Go back out to Europe, Minister, and fight for a quota, and that's what we need. I just wanted to make, because it wasn't made clear there that they had rejected that part of the report.
Unanimous report, point to raise, yes.
And a point of order as well. Perfect example of what government are at here. I was at committee and we were going by the schedule that was in. Government ministers haven't come to appear before it, and the minister talked about Sinn Féin. That's why I've missed my slot, and I apologise, Cion Corla. We've made it quite clear that we're not supporting the thing, so the minister can put it out there all he likes, that he doesn't know where Sinn Féin are coming from. He actually, for the first 5 minutes of his speech, he's talked more about Sinn Féin than he did about the actual bill. Look, we're not supporting any report that's decommissioning and 1/3 of the fleet. So it's time the Minister and his government went out to Europe and actually fought for a change instead of coming in here throwing slanderous remarks.
That concludes our discussion on the Seafood Taskforce final report from October 2021, and thanks to all the members who have partaken.